Hello, my name is Douglas Comer. I'm president of US ICOMOS, the United States National Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites. And I'm here to welcome you to a series of webinars. These webinars will examine the role of World Heritage as we engage with the enormous task of healing the social and economic wounds that have been inflicted by our current global crisis. This is not the first global upheaval. More importantly, it will not be the last. We are, all of us, riding a juggernaut, the juggernaut of technology. It draws us closer together every day as people and as countries. Yet ironically, we are living in a world that seems to be abandoning international cooperation. As an archaeologist who's worked for decades in many places all over the world, I am convinced that societies survive primarily by forming alliances. Thousands of human groups have risen and then fallen because they have neglected this. We live today in a world that is inescapably global. If human groups all over the world do not coordinate in a rational way, we can only move from one disaster to another. ICOMOS can be part of the solution. ICOMOS has 107 national committees. Being part of ICOMOS is to be part of a global network of understanding. US ICOMOS also provides a network among regions and ethnic groups within the United States, most of which have a connection with one or more of the World Heritage Sites in our country. Now, let me be clear. Our objective is not the homogenization of culture. Each culture brings something special to the human experience and to human knowledge. World Heritage Sites provide a sense of place and a sense of culture to the nations and the communities in which they are located. They are also, and usually are, enormous economic drivers. But to realize the benefits that can flow from World Heritage Sites, we must attend to local communities, to local businesses, to local governments, to local indigenous heritage groups, and to other groups with stories yet to be told.
Hello, everybody. Hopefully everybody can hear me. And if you cannot, please go ahead and send in a remark in the chat box. Thank you so much for joining us for US ICOMOS' inaugural webinar, focusing on the US's Civil Rights Movement sites, a potential serial nomination to the UNESCO World Heritage List. My name is Dr. Caroline Chong. I'm an assistant professor of history at the University of Central Florida. Over the next hour, you'll be hearing from experts in the field with extensive knowledge on the nomination and the topic, including Dr. Glenn Eskew from Georgia State University, who's leading the charge for the nomination, Brent Leggs, Executive Director of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Denise Gilmore, Senior Director of Social Justice and Racial Equity, and the Director of Cultural Preservation for the City of Birmingham, and Robert Stanton, former Senior Advisor to the Secretary of the U.S. Department of the Interior and former Director of the National Park Services. After this, we'll have time for questions and answers. Just to give you a quick overview of the World Heritage List, for those of you who are not familiar with it, The World Heritage List, which is administered by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, is an international list intended to draw attention to and conserve sites around the world that demonstrate outstanding universal value, which is defined by a predetermined set of criteria overseen by the World Heritage Committee. And here to tell us more about the group of civil rights sites currently being proposed to the World Heritage List is Dr. Glenn Eskew. Currently, Glenn Eskew heads the Georgia State University World Heritage Initiative that is developing a potential serial nomination of U.S. civil rights movement sites for possible inscription on the World Heritage List. He has written extensively on the civil rights movement and for years engaged school teachers on the subject through National Endowment for the Humanities summer workshops in Birmingham and Atlanta. Over to you, Glenn.
Thank you, Carolyn. Since embarking on this effort to develop a potential serial nomination of U.S. civil rights movement sites for possible inscription on the World Heritage List at the behest of Alabama Tourism in 2016, the Georgia State University World Heritage Initiative has received invaluable guidance from Stephen Morris and Phyllis Ellen of the National Park Service Office of International Affairs, as it has consulted with scholars and historic preservationists on developing the concepts and preparing materials. Paramount to understanding the idea is recognizing the limitations of what is being proposed for World Heritage. The focus is tightly drawn around the post-war African-American freedom struggle and its use of civil disobedience to force change in the built environment. What began as nonviolent protest in a racially segregated society, with white and colored spaces demarcated by law and constructed into the architecture, town planning, and landscape design across the southeastern United States, ended with events that led to the removal of such racist restrictions and the opening of America to all, regardless of race, manifested as desegregated space and celebrated today with the sites turned into shrines to the universal values of freedom, democracy, and equality. Consequently, the effort is organized around World Heritage Criterion 2, the interchange of ideas, over nonviolent protest to redesign the public sphere, and Criterion 6, heritage associated with events of universal significance, the African American demonstrations that inspired the world. While marking a watershed, the removal of legal white supremacy from the built environment across the United States did not end the racist attitudes held by some citizens, racial disparities in the justice system, or transform economic inequalities rooted in centuries of racial oppression. The movement attempted to address many of these intractable problems, from the Beloved Community to the Poor People's Campaign. Despite the considerable achievement of legally opening the system to all, the imperfect union of the United States continues to struggle with persistent racism and inequality. In 2008, when the Park Service updated the U.S. tentative list for World Heritage, it added the 3 Alabama churches, Dexter Avenue Baptist in Montgomery, Bethel Baptist, and 16th Street Baptist churches in Birmingham, with the understanding that additional properties would make a complete proposal. Towards that end, the GSU initiative sponsored a World Heritage and U.S. Civil Rights Movement Site Symposium in 2017, at which dozens of scholars of the civil rights movement gathered in Atlanta with historic preservation and property owners and stakeholders representing civil rights heritage sites to discuss the idea of a potential serial nomination. Prior to this, more than 75 historians of the African American freedom struggle identified the sites they believed testified to the movement. The GSU initiative consulted the 4 NPS thematic studies on civil rights, along with state historic preservation offices, and compiled the results of a survey of scholars to produce initially a list of 120 properties that has since expanded to more than 300 historic properties associated with the movement. Sites visits followed to nearly half of them to evaluate authenticity and integrity. The scholars concluded to focus the effort exclusively on the African American freedom struggle, with the recognition that others could create separate nominations concerning the rights of other groups. To describe the effort as the modern civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, rather than the long civil rights movement, and to frame it between the Brown decision of 1954 and the assassination of Dr. King in 1968. Continued consultation with scholars and preservationists determined which heritage sites best fit with the 3 Alabama churches. Among the suggested properties are sites previously identified in the 2016 U.S. ICOMOS Gap Study, such as Monroe Elementary School in Topeka, Kansas, Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, and the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. As of today, the idea of a potential serial nomination has evolved through numerous draft versions of a Statement of Outstanding Universal Value and justification under World Heritage Criteria 2 and 6. Application for an upstream review of these and related documents was requested of the World Heritage Center in March 2019 and is in process under the auspices of the International Council on Monuments and Sites. The Park Service has requested the Federal Interagency Panel update the tentative list to include additional movement places. The draft narrative is available for review on the U.S. ICOMOS website, and feedback is welcome by the Georgia State University World Heritage Initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Next, we have Brent Leggs, who is the Executive Director of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, a Harvard University Loeb Fellow and author of Preserving African American Historic Places. Brent is a national leader in the U.S. preservation movement and 2018 recipient of the Robert J. Stanton National Preservation Award. Over to you, Brent.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to share my screen from my PowerPoint. Can you confirm that you see it? All right. I am delighted to be with you today to talk about the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, which is signature program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. This first image right here is a World Heritage Site. It is a Thomas Jefferson sculpture on the campus of the University of Virginia. We all remember the tragic events that happened in Charlottesville in 2017, when white nationalists wearing khaki pants, polo shirts, holding tiki torches, would rally around a historic piece of art on a historic landscape imbued with Black humanness and resilience, would advocate for creating a new form of Jim Crow in the United States. We thought that this was a breaking of our cultural values. It didn't reflect who we are as a nation. And we wanted to signal that historic preservation, when we linked public space and culture and heritage together, that we could find a solution for some of our social problems. Thus, the Action Fund was born. In essence, the Action Fund is about making room. It is to expand our nation's understanding of history, to begin to value the role of preservation through a lens of social justice. In essence, our work and this $25 million campaign, the largest ever undertaken on behalf of African American historic places by a private preservation organization, is about influencing and enacting positive social change. One way that we do this is through the lens of equitable interpretation. We want to help to tell the full American story. As you all know, many presidential homes or sites associated to wealthy industrialists or plantation owners. In essence, our historical record has acknowledged and recognized a privileged few. But there are stories embodied within these landscapes and historic buildings. So part of our work at James Madison's Montpelier was to bring recognition to the enslaved worker story by creating a rubric on teaching slavery interpretation and descendant engagement. And this is becoming a national model for governance at traditional historic sites. I want to highlight some really important places of exceptional cultural value, places that represent the American civil rights story that have been funded through our national grant program or supported through other programs at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Last year, we gave a grant to the Harriet Tubman Home, which is in Auburn, New York. I'm sure many of you have heard about the legendary Moses of her people. She is one of the most remarkable women, arguably, in world history. And after leading the Underground Railroad activity, Harriet Tubman would purchase this home in Auburn, New York. She would create a home of the aged to help her community. This place is of exceptional significance. There's the African Meeting House in Boston, Massachusetts. Inside of this building, constructed in 1806, is where the legends of the abolitionist movement, including William Lord Garrison and Frederick Douglass, literally right there in that pulpit. White Americans, Black Americans, for the first time would express their public disdain for this institution known as slavery. The Meeting House matters. We recently gave a grant this year to Historic Mitchellville, which is on Hilton Head, South Carolina. After emancipation, this would become the first self-governed Black community in the United States. Currently, it is a cultural landscape and archaeological site that matters. I love this story associated to Rosenwald schools. Many of you probably know that Rosenwald schools, the idea was born in the mind of this brilliant activist and educator, Booker T. Washington. In response to a crisis in Black education, Booker T. Washington would partner with philanthropist Julius Rosenwald, and together they would fund the construction of over 5,000 schools in 15 southern states, bringing the most architecturally advanced school plans for African American children across the South. And there is a current campaign to create a national park to honor a national park that will honor the first Jewish American and the Rosenwald School story. Historic Vernon AME Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Recently in the news for other reasons, but we provided this year our largest grant of $150,000 to bring life and recognition to historic Greenwood that in 1921 was erased and decimated from a racial massacre. It was a neighborhood called Black Wall Street that formerly had 600 businesses and homes, and this church, it stood after that massacre as the last remnant of this injustice. Our $150,000 grant is supporting the restoration of their stained glass windows. This church has a story to tell. Many of you have heard about the legendary civil rights lawyer, Thurgood Marshall, but you might not know that inside of Founders Library at Howard University, an esteemed historically Black college and university in Washington, D.C., the law school was once housed inside of Founders. This is where Houston and Hamilton and others would devise a legal strategy to desegregate America's public schools. Founders has a story to tell. Thurgood Marshall would refer to Pauli Murray's legal research as the Bible of civil rights law. Pauli Murray, a social justice advocate, a feminist, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in honor of Pauli Murray's legal research, would dedicate her first briefing in this lady's honor. She's a co-founder of the National Organization of Colored Women, the first African-American Episcopal saint. The list is long, and she is a civil rights champion. Her story matters. Many of you have heard and seen the I Am a Man posters that were printed inside of historic Claiborne Temple in Memphis, Tennessee. This is where the civil rights movement became more evolved and elevated and began to link together political activism and economic justice. This is where Dr. King led 15,000 protest marchers to City Hall as part of the sanitation workers movement in 1968. This history matters, and it's relevant to the protest movement that we see today. You probably have heard of the legendary musician Nina Simone. Nina Simone would use her mastery and her talent to become the voice of the American Civil Rights Movement. Although this vernacular structure might first appear unadorned and simple, inside of this space, we would create a civil rights legend and someone that used their talent and artistry to inspire the world. You may have heard about the story, murder, assassination of a young man named Emmett Till. We provided $120,000 to the Emmett Till Interpretive Center so that they could hire their first director of education to build out programs that's focused on reconciliation and telling the story across multiple counties. This is reminiscent of the current civil unrest and the kneeling on the neck that we witnessed in Minneapolis. The last slide that I want to highlight is the A.G. Gaston Motel. And I want to mention this briefly because my greatest honor in my professional life and career was to partner with Mayor William Bell, the former mayor of Birmingham, my colleague Tom Cassidy, Congresswoman Terry Sewell, and a local and national coalition to make the centerpiece of the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument dedicated to telling this story, where Black men, women, and children, armed only with their truth in a spiritual battle against immorality, would test and affirm the timeless idea that purposeful collective action can change our nation and the world. Birmingham is an international story. This space should be a mecca for the world to come and learn the lessons, not of the fire hoses and of the painful part of that history, but to be inspired by the cultural legacy of community organizing, of defining and creating a shared vision and sustaining the commitment to that vision in order to advance positive social change. So last, in memory of the countless unnamed Americans that sacrificed so much, we honor you. To the legends, from Dr. King to Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, to the legendary John Lewis. We thank them for their sacrifice, for their leadership, and that's why it is so important to preserve African American historic places, to honor the full contributions of Black America to this nation and to our world, and to ensure that sites of civil rights receive the recognition that they deserve. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Brent, for sharing the really important work that the Action Fund is doing in such a timely manner as well. Next up, we have Denise Gilmore, who serves as Senior Director of the Office of Social Justice and Racial Equity for the City of Birmingham in the Office of Mayor Randall L. Woodfin. In this role, she directs the Office of Social Justice and Racial Equity, Cultural Preservation, LGBTQ Affairs, Special Projects, Homelessness, and Faith-Based Initiatives, and advises the Office of Peace and Policy. Additionally, Mayor Woodfin has assigned Denise to serve as Special Director of Transition of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute to provide operating leadership while the Institute undertakes a search for a permanent CEO. So over to you, Denise.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And I will also start from the beginning. Thank you. Okay. So thank you. It is my pleasure to join you today to share insights on the City of Birmingham's efforts to undertake both historic and cultural preservation. Birmingham holds a unique place in the history of the struggle for civil and human rights in the United States during the 1950s and the 1960s. And so what I'd like to share and explore with you is Birmingham's stewardship and how we are ensuring that generations yet unborn will know what their forebears sacrificed so that they can enjoy civil and human rights. I want to start on this day that John Lewis was memorialized and laid to rest by paying tribute to these three icons who all touched Birmingham and impacted Birmingham in some manner. Reverend C.T. Vivian, as you've heard over and over, he was the strategist. He came to Birmingham and trained for the children during the Children's March in 1963. Reverend Joseph Lowry in the late 50s was in Mobile, Alabama, and he joined Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and Dr. Martin Luther King to strategize about how to break down segregation. And he later pastored the St. Paul United Methodist Church within the National Monument. And then Representative John Lewis, as a leader of SNCC and as a freedom rider, and during his congressional career, he brought the congressional delegation to Birmingham as part of his faith and politics pilgrimage that he undertook every year, traveling to Birmingham and to Montgomery so that they could firsthand learn the lessons of the history of the struggle for civil rights. I want to share with you just some of the preservation efforts that the City of Birmingham is undertaking. And I want to share with you a little about the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument, share the historic structures reports that are underway, and then just a little bit about our cultural heritage tourism efforts. As Brent has shared with you the collaborative creation of the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument that was created by President Barack Obama in January of 2017, it stands to preserve the stories, the events, and the places associated with the nonviolent struggle against racial segregation in Birmingham, Alabama in the mid-20th century. These stories and events that happened propelled to the forefront of the American consciousness in 1963, and which led to ultimately voting rights and being enacted. So these sites include the A.G. Gaston Motel, the historic Bethel Baptist Church, the 16th Street Baptist Church, St. Paul United Methodist Church, the Colored Masonic Temple, and Kelly Ingram Park, and supported by the historic Fourth Avenue Business District and the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. Actively engages and works to help stand up the national monument. And I want to talk a little more detail about the A.G. Gaston Motel as the key historic site of the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument. So under Mayor Woodfin, the baton was passed, as Brent described, those who collaborated nationally and local and previous administrations in Birmingham. That baton was passed to Mayor Woodfin. And then in my Office of Cultural Preservation, we then began our efforts to restore the motel. We began in January of 2019 with preliminary mock-ups, and then followed by phase one, which is the exterior restoration of the 1954 wing, which is owned and managed by the National Park Service. It includes room 30, the war room, and then as well as the city of Birmingham, which owns and will manage the 1968 wing. So we anticipate that the entire restoration of both wings will be completed by July of 2022. And I'll just share again, the significance of this site is where Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, Reverend Martin Luther King, Reverend A.D. King, and other civil rights leaders gathered to plan and strategize Project C. And that is was the beginning of the marches and the protests in April, as early as April of 1963. And so this is a site, as Brent says, that has stories that must be told, that must be shared, and must be passed on to future generations. The Colored Masonic Temple was the seat of organizing during the movement here in Birmingham. It housed the offices of the NAACP, of civil rights attorney Arthur Shores, and many, many of the Black businesses that supported the movement financially. It's currently, a redevelopment plan is underway that will bring this majestic temple back online as an active participant and an active space in the National Monument. So the Historic Structures Report was graciously funded through a grant by the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund that Brent leads and the Chapman Foundation. It was a grant given to the city of Birmingham for Historic Bethel Baptist Church, the 16th Street Baptist Church, and St. Paul United Methodist Church. Those HSRs are being conducted currently by Lord Ake Sargent under the leadership of Jack Pyburn. The field work has been completed. We anticipate that all of those reports will be available and ready by mid-October. These churches, I want to just note, are all active congregations. So when we think about preservation, these churches are not museums. They are active congregations that have the opportunity to have worship, but yet also be able to tell the stories of what happened in Birmingham in the 1950s and 1960s. They are today still on the front line of serving as a place for the community to gather and to speak out and have a voice on those issues of justice and equality that is so profound today. So the St. Paul United Methodist Church, the focus of its Historic Structures Report is to support the growth of the church, of the congregation and the community, and to help interpret St. Paul's role during the civil rights movement. The priority for this building is the exterior, to preserve the exterior, and then also to address the building's mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems. Additionally, St. Paul has received $1 million from the National Park Service Civil Rights Preservation grants to help advance their preservation efforts. The Historic Bethel Baptist Church, its HSR will document the recent past rehabilitation of the historic sanctuary, as well as the partially remaining guardhouse and the parsonage. The priority for this HSR is stabilizing the remaining front facade of the guardhouse and recapturing the lost character of the interior of the parsonage. Bethel has also received $600,000 in National Park Service Civil Rights Preservation grants. And last is the 16th Street Baptist Church. Their HSR will focus on the documentation of the structure's historic fabric, as well as the church prepares to convert the house from an administrative office to a museum focused on Wallace Rayfield, the prominent African-American architect that designed both the parsonage and the church. 16th Street has received $2 million in National Park Service Civil Rights grants for preservation. They are also the recipient from the Fund for Sacred Places of the National Trust, a $250,000 matching grant. 16th Street was also awarded through the National Main Street campaign $150,000 to continue the preservation of its building. So these preservation efforts are all essential to connecting the physical structures to the rich cultural legacies and their impact on the day-to-day lives of people who are here to live in Birmingham, but also those people that come to visit, to make sure that the stories of what happened here are told and passed down for generations. And so when we pivot to cultural heritage tourism, there really are four things that we want to ensure happens when we undertake cultural heritage tourism. First and foremost, that it must respect the historic legacies, that it maintains cultural authenticity, that it's used to rebuild communities, and then to revive economic opportunities. I want to share with you just a couple of examples of initiatives that are underway with two of the churches that are in the potential serial nomination sites in Birmingham. The 16th Street Baptist Church last fall completed its new exhibits and 1022 experience room, which recalls the events of September the 15th, 1963, where 4 little girls were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. This again allows active worship to take place, but yet is open and available for people to learn the lessons of the past, but also understand that there is still a need right now for understanding about racial justice and racial violence that has taken place in the past, so that we don't repeat that. So and then again, I'd also like to share that the Historic Bethel annually conducts a conference entitled Stoning the Road We Trod. It brings teachers from all across the nation to explore Alabama's civil rights legacy, led by Dr. Martha Boyer, who, by the way, congratulations are in order, because she will receive the Alabama Tourism Director's 2020 award in August. So hopefully I'm not letting the cat out of the bag too soon, but we're very, very proud of the work that she has done. So we look at cultural heritage tourism to help through the eyes and experiences of those who are stewards of these stories, so that they can be told in a way that's authentic and that respects the local community. So Kelly Ingram Park, of course, the site of racial violence from the police, state-sanctioned, Bull Connor, blasted water from fire hoses, and unleashed dogs on children. And so those are the images from 1963. And when we look at the park today, it's a peaceful place. It's hard to imagine that the things that took place in that park occurred, but it did. So we look at it as a place of revolution and of reconciliation, that residents as well as visitors from all over the world can come and to experience the peacefulness of the park and be inspired to continue to work on the forefront to make change. And then the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute is a cornerstone within the National Monument. And I wanted to share these images with you of George Floyd. And this was a mural that was installed right after the downtown at the end of May, when Birmingham experienced destruction downtown from people that rioted and broke windows. And so one of the owners decided to create a mural because he wanted it to reflect of the Wheelhouse Salon here locally. And so he created this beautiful mural that you see of George Floyd and with Beham Strong, meaning Birmingham Strong. And you see it said on there, the struggle continues, because as much as we'd like to think that there's no more work to be done, there is so much to be done. The upper image is what happened, that somebody came through and defaced it. And so the artist came and again fixed that so that people could see the mural as it was originally intended. The Birmingham Civil Rights Institute is the recipient of this mural. It was contributed by the owner of the Wheelhouse Salon to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, where it will become the centerpiece for conversations on racial justice and on healing for visitors to the Institute. Birmingham Civil Rights Institute has also undertaken a series of virtual conversations that occurs weekly on discussions about race, diversity, inclusion, and equity. We know that there is an outcry, a hunger for engagement on racial understanding from the lessons of history today. So Birmingham, of course, the world is watching. Birmingham, what happened here changed the world. Birmingham is still on the forefront of being a leader in racial justice and equity. And so these sites, of course, reflect and represent the outstanding universal values of freedom, democracy, and equality. Through a commitment to nonviolent and relentless protest by the civil rights leaders of the movement. These sites were on the front line for racial justice in the 1950s and 1960s, and today are a beacon for those who are hungry to learn about activism, advocacy, and racial healing. John Lewis compelled us to continue the struggle, to get in good trouble, necessary trouble, wherever we see injustice. And I would just like to close with these words by Martin Luther King. And if you didn't know, you would think that these words were said today in 2020. That history will have to record the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. So as John Lewis compels us, the work to be done is to continue the good trouble so that we can bring about a society that values civil and human rights for all people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Denise, for sharing all the important work that you are doing in Birmingham. Next, we have Robert Stanton, who is the former senior advisor to the Secretary of the U.S. Department of the Interior and former director of the National Park Services. He's an expert member of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, to which he was appointed by President Barack Obama in 2014. As senior advisor to the Interior Secretary, he served as a key senior analyst and provided executive level advice and support to the Secretary on a wide range of environmental, educational, organizational, and management issues. Since beginning his federal career in 1962 as a seasonal park ranger in Grand Teton National Park, he has dedicated his life work to improving the preservation and management of the nation's rich and diverse natural and cultural resources. Over to you, Director Stanton. You might need to unmute your microphone. There you go.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for that kind introduction. Let me hasten to bring you greetings on behalf of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which is an independent federal agency. And I too want to commend Doug and Glenn and Brent and Denise for their outstanding contributions to this discussion. Like most of you who view the funeral services today, we are still moved by the sentiments that were expressed. So I have decided to offer perhaps a philosophical and a historical perspective regarding the importance of our moving forward with a serial nomination leading towards the inscription of the Civil Rights Movement World Heritage Site. I believe it's important that as we look at where we are today, is to consider that last year we paused to reflect upon 400 years of the African American experience in the United States. With my ancestors being introduced to these shores in 1619 in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It is important to understand and appreciate our journey from that day to 2020. And to understand and appreciate the importance of historic or cultural preservation, if you will, to the recording and to the understanding of that journey. Starting again with roughly 20 plus of my ancestors on the shores of Virginia, who stayed in bondage until the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Although a large percentage were emancipated with President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which became effective January 1, 1863. But it was the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery in the United States of America. Fast forward, shortly thereafter, we amended the Constitution with the 14th Amendment, which, among other provisions, provided guaranteed protection under the law for all citizens. Shortly followed by the ratification of the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing voting rights. So, as a nation, as a people, we were on a move. But lo and behold, in 1896, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down its opinion in the Plessy versus Ferguson case that declared, notwithstanding the 14th Amendment, it is okay if we live as a people, as a nation, under the doctrine of separate but equal. I'm a native son of the segregated South, and I lived under that doctrine for 23 years of my life. And I know the sting and the pain of separate but equal, and there was nothing equal in that doctrine. So starting in 1619 up until today, there has been ups and downs with our commitment to providing civil rights for all citizens of the United States. What is interesting in the context of the eloquent discussions and presentations by the previous speakers is that the struggle for civil rights is a continuum that expressed recently by Denise, echoing the sentiments of our late leader, Congressman John Lewis. It is also interesting to note that while the founding fathers wrote and approved the Constitution, which did not specifically address slavery, they did have enough, that we were saying, Texas gumption to provide for the fifth article that allowed for this document to be amended. And it has been amended 27 times in hopes that we could continue to move towards a more perfect union. And that what that tells us in terms of the preservation movement and the possible nomination of the serial dedication or inscription of a World Heritage Site, recognizing the United States Civil Rights Movement, is that any program, any activity should reflect current developments and be flexible enough to amend its conditions. So it is with the Constitution that has been amended. So it is with your National Park Service. And many of the sites referenced earlier are within the 419 units of the National Park System. Many of those sites speaking specifically to the African American experience, the struggle for equal protection under the law, civil rights, if you will. And the park system has grown from Yellowstone National Park in 72 to now the 14 and 19 units. And in other areas will be added. So I liken that to the World Heritage Site program, now neighboring something over 1,100 sites internationally. It too is a dynamic program that should be amended or other sites included to recognize our collective heritage. I must add that within your national park system are 19 of the current World Heritage Sites within the United States. And although I'm without portfolio with respect to being an official of the Department of the Interior or the National Park Service, it would be my fervent hope that this nomination will proceed and will be ultimately approved for inscription on the World Heritage Site, and that other sites will follow. For it is my belief, drawn from some 60 years of being associated with preservation of our cultural heritage, that the thirst for human dignity, for freedom, for justice, and equity has no limitation with respect to international boundaries. So it's critically important that we endorse, we support, and we encourage all involved to move forward with this nomination, because I believe fervently that the experiences of the civil rights movement in the United States could serve as sources of reference, sources of encouragement and inspiration to people around the world who are themselves in the struggle for civil rights. And in that struggle, let us always, always be mindful of involving the most cherished resource that any nation has. That's its youth. It has been the tradition of the National Park Service and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and others to increasingly involve our youth, not only from an intellectual and emotional development, but hands-on opportunities in historic preservation. So let us always, as we consider the importance of this nomination, to be mindful of our youth and their engagement, their development, and their future. And I'm proud that the youth are taking up the mantle in terms of being in the struggle, or as Mr. Douglas would say, agitating for freedom and justice. And certainly Congressman Lewis would say, good trouble. Let me conclude with a thought in terms of an intangible benefit of these historic or cultural resources. May they be here in the United States, South Africa, such as Robben Island Prison, where the international leader Nelson Mandela was held and released in 1990. Let us remember that there are some intangible benefits that are of tremendous value. And the preeminent historian, Dr. John Hope Franklin, served as the National Park System Advisory Board Chair during my tenure of the National Park Service, concluded with this: the places that commemorate sad history are not places in which we should allow or wallow in remorse, but rather be moved to a high resolve to become better citizens. Ladies and gentlemen, I salute, I applaud all of you who are engaged in this nomination process. And when all is said and done, and when this serial nomination is approved and inscribed on the World Heritage List, we can say that we are becoming better citizens. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Director Stanton, for that, for your stirring comments. If I can ask the other panelists at this time, Brent and Denise and Glenn, to bring your videos up. We have a few questions from all of our 250 plus participants. The first being, do you have suggestions about one or two sites that might be added to the serial nomination of sites to the World Heritage List, which kind of actually dovetails with the third question that we had in about whether or not sites were to be added to the nomination?
Yeah, I'll go first. I think every single site that I listed has potential and should be considered. And I highlighted those because they have a strong civil rights component. And it's my understanding there are 300 plus civil rights sites that have been identified nationally. So whatever the process takes to fully vet the civil rights sites that should be recommended for listing, further exploration needs to happen. But I think the most important thing is that all of us here, all of these leaders in preservation in the US, that we are champions and supporters of having World Heritage designation that honors Black America's contribution to the world. And there's nothing more uniquely African American than the American Civil Rights Movement.
Caroline?
Yeah, go ahead, Director
If
Stanton.
I may, I ditto Brent's comment, but I also have a deep reverence for the men and women who fought in the military services for this nation. African Americans have fought in every war of this country. 5,000 plus with General George Washington, the Revolutionary War. Hundreds upon hundreds in the War of 1812. 200,000 sailors and soldiers with the Union forces in the Civil War. Countless number in World War I, World War II, Korean War. but I would hold out Port Chicago Naval Magazine in California in 1944, where the sailors experienced discrimination, different type of treatment in terms of training and supervision, which resulted in a major explosion, killing roughly 300 sailors. And it is reportedly said that that incident led President Truman to issue his executive order in 1948, integrating the military services of the United States of America. Why did we take so long? That story has to be told. And it is told, but it has national significance, international significance.
You're on mute.
There we go. The next question that we have is, looking beyond the civil rights movement, which sites associated with more recent American history do you think should be recognized and or designated?
Denise, you want to take this?
Well, that's an interesting question because, and I was literally thinking, I don't know how, first of all, when you say look beyond the civil rights movement, because I guess I would argue that what we see today is a continuum of the civil rights movement. It's not like the events in the 50s and 60s, ended everything, took care of everything. There was no more work to be done. So I would argue that the outcry and the outpouring that we're seeing across the nation today is a continuum of the civil rights movement. It is that next phase. And so I would think that some of those sites will reveal themselves over the next several years. Certainly perhaps the Minneapolis, to mark the fact that it was unfortunately a terrible murder of George Floyd that caused the nation to stop and to take notice, but that it will signal, I believe, a significant ushering in of the next phase of civil and human rights, and particularly changes with against police brutality.
The next question is, do you consider intangible heritage in your, I think, this says file, but I think it means life? I'm not sure, but maybe the question we can interpret that as, how does intangible heritage fit in with the work that you do?
I would say intangible heritage is important and it's been undervalued. And for example, in Birmingham, when the National Historic District nomination was being developed for listing in the National Register of Historic Places, they identified the marching routes throughout the city. And in essence, that is a form of intangible heritage that then connects to the physical evidence of Birmingham's civil rights past. So I think it's exceptionally important. I just want to go back to your very first question as I thought about it again. What are some additional sites? I think every contributing civil rights landmark in Birmingham that is acknowledged as part of the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument is a good starting place for expansion.
Caroline, if I may, ditto Denise and Brent, there are a number of systems, if you will, or programs that allow the American people to express their interest in preserving places that are important to them, that gives them encouragement, that allow them to honor their predecessors. And many of those areas are identified and continue to be identified through the listing on the National Register of Historic Places, and also a designation of National Historic Landmarks. These, in many instances, are private resources, but yet they still have been recognized by the federal government, as has been national significance to the American people. So I think there has to be a continuing evaluation, a continuing encouragement from individuals at the grassroots or community levels, if you will, for them, based on their own interests and initiative, to identify those places that are important to them and to their posterity.
Thank you very much. So another question that we have is, in your years of work, have you found ways that drew and kept attention to engage with these historic sites and nominations? Is there an example of ways that kept engagement, i.e. specific signs or artifacts, vocal stories, what did or didn't work? In some ways, I think my interpretation of this question is really that about how certain stories are kept in different mediums in terms of the interpretive value of some of these stories, the ephemera, as we would call it in the heritage world.
So I will just share that what comes to mind in Birmingham, particularly within the National Monument, the reenactment of the Children's March takes place every year.
Yes.
It's a way of keeping in the forefront the fact that actually young people were on the front line. And it happened in Birmingham. So we look at, when you look at the March for Life and other protest movements now that younger people are leading, it happened and started here in Birmingham with children being trained from St. Paul and 16th Street to march into Kelly Ingram Park and to downtown to try to change. And so that is one example. And then, of course, every September, we pause and we pay tribute to the lives of 4 little girls who were murdered by the KKK. So there are things that we continue to do to engage and to uplift these stories, but to also to put it in its proper context for today.
I'll just add to Denise's eloquent description, the World Monuments Fund, in collaboration with the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute and the Alabama Civil Rights Heritage Consortium, to collect and capture the stories of the surviving civil rights activists. And it's beautifully documented in a way that helps to keep their contributions to civil rights alive. It's ephemeral, it is storytelling, it's oral history, and it's a form of preservation.
Caroline, the Advisory Council of Historic Preservation is very proud to be a partner with the National Park Service and the National Trust for Historic Preservation in a program we call Preservation in Practice that engage university-level students who are studying in the field of architecture to experience hands-on preservation. And it has been really remarkable to see how it has broadened their perspective, their vision, their interest, their enthusiasm of becoming engaged and recognizing the importance of preserving these special places. And also in hopes that they would want to pursue a career in cultural or historic preservation because they are the ones that will be on Zoom in the future, speaking about their experiences and their commitment to continuing to be in the struggle in preserving and recognizing our foreparents in hopes that we have learned from them to build, as Congressman Lewis said, a blessed community.
So another question here that we have that I think is actually a great question because it gets to sort of the technicalities of how we do the work is, I wonder if the panelists could talk about how, as a preservation community, we can work within the existing National Register system that so often makes it impossible to make the case that African American sites should be listed. And Brent, you got to this a little bit talking about integrity. Again, this is often due to a lack of integrity based on the existing criteria, or should we just redo the entire system?
Yeah, I will. So as you can imagine, preservationists have had many conversations about this. I don't think that we need to dismantle the National Register. We need to create space and understand that places that were architecturally designed that were associated to white wealth and privilege thus stand with integrity. Many African American historic places where the neighborhoods and the spaces have changed over time have lost some of that integrity, but the cultural meaning, the spirit, the place itself as a representation of the Black experience has exceptional universal value. And so social history and cultural history, in our view, is equal to architectural significance. And so partly what we need is a paradigm shift in preservation. And that goes through all levels, from the way we review at the international level, the way that we review at the national level, the way that we review at the state level, and the way that we locally designate at the local level. That's reimagining contemporary preservation for the 21st century.
Caroline, if I may, I would also encourage members of the African American community, and having again grown up in the doctrine of separate but equal era, I know that in the past there was not that level of involvement by African Americans in the preservation movement, and there were many barriers to that. But I would encourage members of the African American community to be fully engaged in this noble endeavor. Equally, I would encourage those organizations that have a preservation mandate to aggressively and comprehensively reach out to all segments of our society to tell them that collective preservation is just that. It's a collective effort. And sometime in terms of the federal system of which I have experienced for some 50 years, you may have to do what Mr. Douglas advised us in 1857. We may have to agitate. We may have to agitate to get things moving. And nothing's wrong with a little agitation.
We have time for one more question. I will say we do have a lot of questions coming in about sort of the logistics of the nomination process, different criterion, as well as additions to the nomination, questions about the full list of the 300 candidate sites. I will say, and our Doug Comer will come on later just to reiterate this, that we're hoping to have an extended answering of these kinds of sort of more technical or logistical questions on the website later. So if their questions are not answered right now, know that we will get to them in a follow-up on the website. So the last question that we have that I think our panelists are well suited to respond to is, the framing of this discussion seems to be that we should be inspired by the history of white supremacist violence and the brutality suffered by nonviolent resistors. Is this an appropriate framing of history? We're not anywhere close to racial healing in this country, and for many Black activists today, that's not even a goal. Nor did the civil rights movement achieve Black liberation or even equal access to employment, housing, and schools. Could we use this project to raise questions about the movement and its history rather than just celebrate or seek, quote unquote, inspiration from it? It's a big one, but one I think that you were well poised to answer. Or try to.
Yes. Does anyone want to go first, or I'm happy to?
You take the lead, Brent.
I respect that viewer's question and perspective. These civil rights sites don't stand to dismantle centuries of injustice. Denise kept communicating in her message, it's a continuum. These places help us measure progress. What's beautiful about preservation is historic sites are a safe space for having the most difficult conversations about American history. And I think that we should leverage the power of these places, align the discussions based on that history, to be able to put together a blueprint that draws from the lessons of civil rights activism to create a better future. So it's not just about the inspiration. And that's why I ended my remarks by saying, like, the images that shocked the world in the 1960s with the fire hoses and the police dogs and all of that, that was the message that was relevant for that time to shift consciousness. The message that's relevant now is the power of Black America to change the consciousness of a nation, to change public policy, to influence and advance economic justice. So we need to uplift the culture of activism, of community organizing, the principles that set the blueprint that has allowed us to be here today to have a multi-generational and multiracial discussion about history.
Brent, I would agree with those comments. I would say that certainly it is not to uplift violence perpetrated on Black people. But I think that it serves as memory so that history does not repeat itself. I think it's important that every generation knows what happened so that it's not forgotten. But then also, the people are not sitting idly by and saying this is history and just looking at it for historical value, but using it as a blueprint and to today, young people, middle schoolers, they want to be actively involved in protest and in changing systems. And then also to look at the power we have now through our vote. When in the 1950s and 60s, it was all about trying to get the vote. Now it's getting people to understand the power of that vote to change systems and the people who are there. Because if you keep the same people there that are responsible for creating the system, you're not going to have systemic change. So I certainly think there's a lot of room in the work that we're doing.
Dr. Stanton, did you want to?
Yes, Caroline, I would like to go back to what I had mentioned at the outset. We made a commitment. We made a legal binding commitment in 1868, I'm sorry, to guarantee equal protection under the law. And then if you were to record our behavior as a people in a nation from that enactment to today, and what you will see through the lens of historic preservation, that we wavered from that commitment. But the goal is to assure that every citizen has equal protection under the law. And what historic preservation taught us, that when you record what you have done, good, bad, or indifference, you may have a legal case to say that you have to live up to the Constitution. So the Supreme Court decided in 1954 that we find unanimously in the field of public education the doctrine of separate but equal, has no place. It's because we had made a recording of what has occurred and we fell short. So the Supreme Court said, let's move forward. Let's stay with the eye on the prize. Equal protection under the law. And preservation would tell us whether we're making any progress or not.
And thank you all very much to Director Stanton, Brent, and Denise so much for sharing your thoughts and experiences with us. All so important, especially during the time that we're living in right now. I'd like to now ask Doug Comer to come on and give us a sign off, as well as share some of the logistical information that I mentioned as well. Thank you.
Yes, I'm very moved by what I've heard. I want to thank all of our outstanding speakers. given us a lot to think about. The civil rights movement discussion, I think, is just beginning, and I want to encourage everybody who's tuned into this or is listening to this to continue the thoughtful engagement with this idea. I'm thinking about a lot of things that were said, what Brent said about uplifting the culture of activism. Yes, I mean, this is quite inspirational. Civil rights is about the civil rights for everybody. Thank you all again. Thank you to the speakers, and thank you to those of you who work behind the scenes to bring this all together. I also want to thank everybody for attending the webinar today. And you will be receiving some communique from us that will, you can see some of it on the screen. Of course, we would like you to become involved with US ICOMOS. But you'll also be receiving some information about subsequent ways to become engaged with the issues that were raised in this webinar. You'll be receiving an email, I believe, from our membership coordinator, and we do encourage you to use this as an opportunity to maintain your engagement, just to begin your engagement. Thank you again. Thank you all. I will mention that we'll soon be announcing our next webinar, where we will be looking at the controversy surrounding the Confederate monuments. All of you stay safe, stay well, and let's all together work, fight the good fight.
And sorry, I just wanted to remind you as well that this will be recorded and posted on social media. Or it has been recorded and will be posted on social media. And again, we will get to the questions, the logistical questions regarding the nomination that people were asking. And I'm sorry we didn't have enough time to do so. But to reiterate Doug's words, thank you so much.
Farewell.